So welcome everybody to our webinar today to talk about the Superb City Wrens and Urban Citizen Science project. And what we're going to do is give you a little bit of a history of how the project started, what we found from our research so far, and what we're doing with this Wren Watch project on a Melbourne-wide basis, and how you can get involved. And we'll step through some of the components of, being part of the monitoring, what to do, how to do it, and obviously be some time for questions at the end. We will start though with an acknowledgement of country. So we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this work is taking place, the Bunurong and Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and recognise their deep and long-standing connection with the lands and waters. And we are doing our best to honour that legacy and make a positive contribution to country and the land going forward. So, what do we know about birds in cities? Well, but we know that urbanisation completely transforms landscapes from what they were to basically a new type of ecosystem. And it can be really, really varied. There's lots of building, there's lots of people, there's lots of infrastructure. There's also lots of parks and green space of all different shapes and sizes. But often the most common type of green space is something like this: big open grassy parks, great big canopy trees. And lots of birds can do really, really well in this environment, native birds as well. So the noisy miners, the parrots and the honey eaters, because we tend to plant the trees that they absolutely love and provide really valuable resources for. The problem is that they are kind of bullheads and can be really, really, really mean and exclusive to other species, and actually have a detrimental impact when they're overabundant or excluding our little bush birds. And so our little bush birds can really struggle, not just because the kinds of habitats that they might need, those shrubs and those grasses and that really lovely complex leaf litter, is missing, but also because they are actively then excluded by these big, loud, colourful birds. And that is also a little bit of a part of our tendency to simplify urban landscapes. You can see there's not a lot of structure in this picture. There's not a lot of mess. There's not a lot of untidiness. And sometimes that complexity is really, really critical to providing habitat, not just for our little bush birds like wrens and thornbills and pardalotes, but a whole host of other biodiversity. So what are the actual opportunities for little bush birds in cities? How do we reframe the way that we look at cities as just great big negative impacts that happen to have a few isolated pockets of nature in them, to restructure them and recreate them as places that can support bush birds in all sorts of environments? What do we need to change about the way we manage cities? What are our opportunities to actually help these birds out? How can we create more space for our little birds in cities? And another really big part of what we're trying to do here is learn more about what little bush birds need, because we tend to overlook the ecology of species in cities. What we often do is take lessons from how the birds behave out in the bush, out in nature, and we try and apply that to an urban environment, but we don't really understand what an urban environment looks like and how it functions for these species. How do the novel parts of our urban ecosystem actually support birds being able to stay? And I guess what we're thinking about when it comes to things like fairy wrens is something that maybe looks a little bit more like this. You can see we still have our beautiful canopy trees, but we have all of this wonderful shrubbery and complexity underneath it. So could making changes like this suddenly help more of our smaller bush birds survive in more places in our cities? And this brings us to the Superb City Wrens project, and what is all the fuss about? So the reason that we're focusing on superb fairy wrens is firstly that they are adorable and very, very colourful. So they're a great species to engage people with. They're easy for most people to identify. Most people are familiar with blue wrens or fairy wrens. They're also really common across Southeast Australia. So the things that we learn about them in Melbourne can be applied more broadly. They, as I've mentioned, can be quite vulnerable in urban habitats because of the ways that we have simplified and managed vegetation. And we think that they can be really responsive by adding that dense mid-story vegetation. Those prickly shrubs, those grasses, might be able to make a really big difference on their ability to spread through cities and survive. And because they rely on that complexity and that vegetation, it means that they're a really good umbrella species for heaps of other urban birds, but also insects and lizards and other things that depend on that leaf litter. So by figuring out how to make urban habitats better for fairy wrens, we can actually help a much broader range of species as well. And this happened in partnership with the City of Melbourne. This is how the project all began. And they realised that Royal Park was a bit of a fairy wren hotspot for them, but also that most of those fairy wrens were just in one isolated corner. So Royal Park's known as one of the crown jewel parks of Melbourne, and yet all across the expanse of the park that's managed for biodiversity and people, we still have fairy wrens just in this little corner up the top. So why aren't they in more places? So what the City of Melbourne were hoping to do, or have started to do, is to change the structure of the vegetation through the park, planting some corridors and new patches of that shrubby, fairy wren friendly habitat to see, can we place these corridors and these vegetation patches strategically across Royal Park to help fairy wrens spread into more places across Royal Park and start to colonise more of the park. Can we get fairy wrens to occur in more places by making these small tweaks to what we're adding to the park? And that's how this project started. So we established a partnership across the City of Melbourne, the University of Melbourne, RMIT and BirdLife Australia. And we had some research questions that we were really interested in, which is, where are superb fairy wrens in the City of Melbourne? Where are they missing from? And what's the difference between those two things? What's driving where fairy wrens are and where they aren't? Because if we can understand that a little bit more, then we can figure out what changes we need to make to the landscape to bring them back and to allow them to occur in more places. We wanted to know how well the strategic revegetation that the City of Melbourne was doing would bring them back. And which urban vegetation features are most important? Can they also use things like nature strips and roadsides and old power line corridors? What kinds of places that we might not think to look are they using? And we're also interested in whether or not being part of a broader citizen science project helps people reconnect with nature. Now I'm going to hand over to Holly, who's going to talk a little bit about our research to date. Holly.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kylie. So I'll just kick off quickly because there's a part of this project which is kind of an extra layer of complexity, at least for our work that we've been doing in Royal Park. And that is that we've actually been banding the individual fairy wrens in that little hotspot in the north western corner of Royal Park. I'll just readmit Graham into the meeting. And what we've been individually putting a little combination of, with my fairy wren model here, although you can see it much better on the screen, we've got a combination of different little tiny colour bands on a small population of those birds in the park. We've also been banding some of the other small bush birds in there, but they don't get the secret individual combo. They're just getting a blue band that tells us that they were captured in Royal Park. Can you go to the next slide, Kylie? Thanks. So as you can see here, we've got every bird that we band gets a blue band on its left leg. And then the fairy wrens get a unique combination of two different colours on their other leg. This helps us to identify individuals, which is really useful for understanding finer scale movements and also a few other things about their behaviour. And it also helps us to understand when we do see those fairy wrens out in the wider landscape, it helps us to understand where they've come from. Now, these bands are really tiny. Each one weighs really no more than a dewdrop. And lots of our work especially with BirdLife, so this is undertaken under a strict ethics permit from the Australian Bat and Bird Banding Society. And a lot of our work in that kind of corner of Royal Park has been about resighting these birds to make sure that they're all doing really well while they're carrying around these little bits of leg jewelry. But if you could go to the next slide, Kylie. So the individual colours allow us to learn a little bit more about how they move. So this isn't just do we put vegetation in the landscape and then we see more birds, but actually tells us, well, when we do see more birds, where did they come from? Because it's possible that the fairy wrens might be coming from different populations. So we really wanted to understand that. The really great thing about putting the individual colours on, and if Kylie goes to the next slide, is that we start to uncover some more exciting things about their behaviour and their biology. So for example, we have this bird that during the winter has female plumage, which you can see in the main photo there, and then in the summer takes on a male-based plumage, which is this much sort of slightly, she has a slightly different type of plumage to a typical male. It's kind of this pale dusky blue. But the really exciting thing is that we wouldn't have known this. We would have thought that these were two different birds without having that individual leg band combination. And so the next slide. Oh, sorry, go for it.
I just would point out, we know that she's definitely female. So this isn't the typical change that we see in males, because a lot of the males do change colour and they eclipse and they go brown. This is a female that's exhibiting male testosterone potentially related changes during the breeding season, which is really interesting.
Now, the problem with fairy wrens is that they are very small and they move around a lot. And although we do have some dedicated ecologists out there doing structured surveys specifically for this project, we really need boots on the ground to be able to understand the kind of population level movement. And that's why we turned this into a citizen science project. And so we developed this very simple protocol, the 15-minute Wren Watch. In the first iteration of this, we asked people to go to some strategic locations, specifically around Royal Park, because we wanted to see if we could track those changes over time with the revegetation process. But actually, all sorts of sightings from all over the place are really welcome. And that's part of what we're talking about today. The idea of the 15-minute Wren Watch is it's a really short survey, but it's really standardized, which makes it really easy for us to use in our models later. And if you carry on, Kylie. And the great thing is we've started to get some good sightings in. So this is the sightings we had to date before we started the Melbourne-wide BioBlitz. And what you can see here is we've got a few sightings from all over. There's a real cluster around Royal Park, but there's some going down the Moonee Ponds Creek. And if you flick to one last slide from me, you can see that we actually identified a fairy wren that was banded in Royal Park, but was seen much further up north on the Merry Creek, which is a lot further than we'd originally expected these birds to move. And again, without the banding project, we wouldn't have been able to know this at all. So thanks, Kylie. Over to you for the last bit.
Beautiful. And that brings me to what we're trying to do now, which is expand this citizen science program across the city. And the main reasons for that is because birds don't obey human boundaries as much as we like. Sometimes they don't even obey the scientific literature that we've written out for them, which probably would have said that there's no way that a fairy wren can move from Royal Park all the way up 5 kilometres to occur in Marybeck. But there you go. So what we're trying to do here is get more eyes on the ground, enable us to capture more data and get a much better understanding of where fairy wrens are and aren't through the city. And that will help us learn what we can change to make sure that they are in more places. And it's been a really fun project, so we'd like to get more people involved. So we're calling on people across Melbourne to be part of this citywide citizen science project. And we've got lots of formal partners that have come on board, and these are mostly councils or other organisations like the cemetery, for example, that recognise the space that they have and what it could contribute to the conservation of fairy wrens in cities, and are also really looking for this kind of information to help them guide their planting strategies and their management strategies and improve the way that these areas are caring for nature across cities more broadly. So we've got more than 15 organisations that have jumped on board. If you aren't from somewhere on this list, that doesn't mean that you can't take part. We'd still love you to take part in your neighbourhood. So please do, and maybe you could contact your council and let them know, because most of them would probably be pretty excited about this. For each of the councils and partners that are involved, we've provided a really lovely 2-page fact sheet that gives a bit of a step-by-step of how to be involved, what fairy wrens look like, and where some of that council's priority sightings are in the area, so where they want to learn more about. So if you are from one of those council areas, you can head to our website or maybe get in touch with us separately, and we can make sure that you have a copy of this so that you can contribute. But of course, we'd love to hear from anywhere that you're seeing them, because the more different places that we aren't expecting to look that we can get information from, the much better picture we'll have. So you can take part anytime this week. We've focused on a bit of a concentrated blitz to really get a great detailed snapshot of at any one time, what do we know about the city? And that's the reason for setting it across the week. You can pick a location, again, one of the priority areas, or just your favorite spot or somewhere that you're curious about. You set a timer for 15 minutes and just start counting. It's as simple as that. This is what we call an active search, so you don't have to stand stock still and looking in one direction and not move. You're free to move around a little bit, especially if you're in a patch of shrubs and you want to have a little bit of a look and make sure that you're really getting to see what's there. Our focus is on small bush birds, so things like your fairy wrens, your pardalotes, your wagtails, all of those little birds that might be responding to that kind of vegetation. You can, of course, record all the birds you see, but depending on where you are, that might be a lot and it might get a bit overwhelming. So feel free to focus just on the fairy wrens and smaller birds. Not everyone loves to use an app, especially when you're out in the field trying to look at stuff. So you can just write your observations down on a notepad and then upload it later to iNaturalist, or you can use the app in the field, which lots of people prefer. It's totally up to you. If you are using iNaturalist, it's a really wonderful app. I love it just for if you see something that you don't know what it is, you can snap a photo and upload it. And experts on the other end will verify it and actually tell you what it is. So that's a wonderful function that it has if you're not sure what you're seeing. But once you've downloaded it, you search for the Superb City Wrens project. So you click on this little orange button called Projects down here. And then the next thing you will see is a search bar. And if you type Superb City Wrens, you'll see our project pop up here. You can just click on that and it will take you to this page. You can see mine says leave here, but when you first sign in, it will ask if you would like to join, because I am already joined and I didn't want to leave it by accident in case something bad happened. And once you've joined Superb City Wrens, it will come up on all of your observations as an opportunity for you to mark them against the project. And that's what we really want. That's how we're making sure that all the fairy wren observations are going into this project. When you're using iNaturalist to record your sightings, so once you've seen a bird that you want to add or you're going over your notes, you go down to the bottom here and click this little button called Observe. It might be a plus sign or a camera, depending on your platform. And then you'll have a screen like this pop up, and you can either choose to add no media if you don't have a photo. You can use the camera right there and then to take a photo of what you're seeing, or you can upload a photo from your photo library of something you've seen previously. And then it will take you to this screen where you just type in here what you saw. So you would see fairy wren, for example. It will record the time and the date. If you upload a photo from your library, it will automatically recognize the time that that was taken. And this little button here is to change where you saw that sighting. So if you're taking this in the field and using it there and then, you don't need to do anything here. It will just recognize where you are. But if you're uploading your notes from previously, you'll actually just need to change this to make sure that it's not saying all the fairy wrens live in your house. And you can move that button to where you saw the fairy wrens and where you made your observations. But the really important thing to do here is to go down to projects, and it will come up with a list of the projects that you're part of, and click that the observation is part of Superb City Wrens. And that makes sure that it's linked to our project and that we can see that data. Holly, did you want to add anything about that?
No, only that I couldn't see your mouse where you were gesturing to where people choose their location.
Okay.
So I don't know why I couldn't see it.
Maybe me neither, actually. Yeah.
That's okay. So on my page, at the moment it says Winchelsea Ward.
Yes.
And it's that little little Google point, or that little location point.
So you can click in that box and select the location of where you saw. Brilliant.
And it will just show you a map, and you can basically move the point around to the reserve that you knew you were in, or wherever you were visiting. And once you've identified, labeled it as being part of this project, you'll see a little project button turn to 1, and then you just click share or submit or whatever your app says, the big green box, and it will upload your observations. A little bit of Fairy Wren 101, getting to know the characters, getting to know their sounds and getting to know their behaviours. As we've touched on a little bit, they do change colour. The males and females look a little bit different once you know what to look for. So they have their big blue fancy lead male breeding plumage with the stark black beak and just the general wonderful dapper colours. And then we have our females, our jennies, which are brown. They have orange legs and an orange beak and around the eyes there. Just to make things more confusing, the males also tend to change colours. So this is a male going from his very, very fancy breeding plumage to a very scruffy intermediate phase, which is called eclipsing. So that's when he's either getting his new fancy feathers or losing them for that season, because being blue all the time is kind of dangerous in nature, and they try not to do it if they don't have to. And then a male that's in non-breeding plumage looks like this. So they still have quite a blue tail, but they'll have a little dark black beak. And often people think that they're only seeing female birds or they haven't seen a male in a while, but it will just be that all the males are hiding. Mostly I hear fairy wrens. I don't see them, I hear them first, and it'll be this very busy, angry chittering. They're always carrying on in the shrubs, and that's a really good signal to look around. And you'll probably again find them somewhere like this. So something a bit like a golf course often is a really good place, because they have this mix of open grassy areas and then the rougher areas and the shrubs and then the tall trees that are providing quite a complex mix of patterns. And these are the kinds of places that fairy wrens hang out, because they can get that shelter and that refuge, as well as all the wonderful insects that come with that. If you don't see anything, that's actually really useful to record as well. And in that what did you see box, you can just write nothing or absence, because that way we know that you went out and looked at a place, then there just wasn't anything there. And absence data is really critically important to science, as important as the observation data, because it means that we know that someone made an effort to look and there wasn't anything there. And we often don't have that kind of information. We usually only have the presence data. So we know there's stuff there, but we don't know if we've looked everywhere yet. And that's what actually helps us identify those patterns in what's making fairy wrens be where they are. And is it just because we didn't look where we thought they wouldn't be? And so it's really, really important. Don't be disheartened if you go somewhere and there are none. That's really useful, because it means if we repeat this project next year or the year after or in 5 years' time, we can actually look at what changed and say, well, we know we looked here before and there was nothing. Now we've made a change, we've planted some shrubs, and all of a sudden fairy wrens are appearing. That is so, so powerful, that information for science. Most important part is to have fun. This is a really great way to just stop for 15 minutes and focus on something that's not the hecticness of Christmas impending on everybody's time, to actually really pay attention to the nature in your neighbourhood and get a sense for what's around. These are the sightings that have come in already. The Blitz launched on Sunday, and already we're getting sightings from across Melbourne, which is really exciting. And this is something that we were hoping would happen. This real city-wide approach is really, really powerful. And so we'd love to see this completely explode with new marks in the next little while. And I guess I should finish by saying, this whole project is working towards getting a better understanding of the ecology of small bush birds in cities and towns. We want to know how we can help, and the sightings that you contribute to this Wren Watch are helping us build an evidence base that we can learn from, and that's going to be used to guide the science and action across Melbourne.